Welcome to my next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to follow more amazing content. Mrs. Eleanor, an elderly white woman hardened by a life of luxury, looked back on her life inside her magnificent mansion with its beautiful scenery. Her life had been shaped by the opulence and love of her family, especially her only son, a young, successful billionaire named Charles. However, after her son had gone abroad to study and began building his own life, Mrs. Eleanor began to feel a hidden loneliness. One afternoon, she decided to take a walk through a small neighborhood, away from the brownish garden and fish pond of her estate. As she wandered through the area where the working-class people lived, her eyes happened to fall upon a black child playing in front of a rundown house. There was something about the child that startled Mrs. Eleanor and made her ponder. It was the child's eyes, smile, and facial features, all of which reminded her of her son when he was young. Mrs. Eleanor couldn't explain this image, this strange feeling. Every glance from the child seemed to seep into her mind, pushing her into a fog of doubt and worry. Mrs. Eleanor decided to go back there and speak to the child. She knew she couldn't ignore something that her heart was urging her to do. After a brief conversation, Mrs. Eleanor learned that the boy's name was Marcus, a healthy and cheerful child who lived with his mother, Mrs. Angel, a simple laboring woman who worked every day to provide for her small family. Inside Mrs. Eleanor, an indescribable feeling arose, not just sympathy, but also a strange and unexplainable bond. Some time later, unable to endure the doubt and curiosity any longer, Mrs. Eleanor decided to conduct a secret DNA test. She went to a reputable testing center and discreetly obtained a sample from Marcus. Each day passed with her lost in thought, wondering if fate had brought her to this child. Finally, the DNA test results arrived. Mrs. Eleanor held the envelope in her hands, her heart pounding, her breath almost caught in her throat. When she opened the envelope and read the results, she couldn't believe her eyes. Marcus was indeed related to her, specifically the grandson she had never known. This revelation was shocking and overwhelmed Mrs. Eleanor. But at the same time, it opened a new door for her, an opportunity to love and make amends. Mrs. Eleanor decided to approach Mrs. Angel and Marcus to learn more about their circumstances. She knew that Charles, her son, had a complicated romantic past, and Mrs. Angel was likely a part of that past. However, what Mrs. Eleanor cared about most was how to help the mother and child, as well as how Marcus could receive the love and care he deserved. The story continues with the journey of Mrs. Eleanor, Mrs. Angel, and Marcus, as they had to learn how to adapt to one another, overcome the challenges of the past, and build a new future. Mrs. Eleanor, from a wealthy but lonely woman, had now found new joy and meaning in life. Marcus, from a child lacking, now had the opportunity to receive the education and love he deserved. Charles, Mrs. Eleanor's son, upon learning about the situation, also returned to face his past and take responsibility. He had to go through a process of self-reflection and inner struggle to accept the truth and his role as a father. Over time, they found harmony and true family love, a love that knew no boundaries of skin color or social status, but was simply the connection of hearts. Mrs. Eleanor decided to bring Marcus to live in the mansion, where Marcus, for the first time, experienced the luxury and comfort of a life he had never known. However, this also posed new challenges as Marcus had to adjust to an entirely different environment. Marcus, with his innocent and energetic nature, quickly drew the attention of people in the mansion. However, not everyone accepted the presence of the boy. Some of the household staff held prejudices about Marcus's skin color and background, leading to conflicts and injustices that Marcus had to face. This compelled Mrs. Eleanor to step forward and defend her grandson, while also forcing her to confront the deep-rooted prejudices within her own environment. Mrs. Angel, although grateful for Mrs. Eleanor's help, still kept a certain distance. She worried about her son being hurt in this unfamiliar world. The relationship between her and Mrs. Eleanor also had to go through trials. from differences in viewpoints on life to the challenges of raising and caring for Marcus. Over time, they gradually learned to respect and understand each other, forming a strong connection. Charles, after returning, faced mixed emotions. He felt guilty towards Mrs. Angel and Marcus and had to find a way to atone for his past mistakes. Charles began spending more time with Marcus, trying to make up for the years he had missed. Although Marcus was initially shy and distant, Charles's sincerity gradually melted the boy's heart. They began building a father-son relationship from the simplest of things, playing basketball together, reading books, and sharing stories about life. The story also expanded as Mrs. Eleanor decided to use her wealth to create positive changes for the community where Marcus had once lived. She began participating in charity activities, building schools, and creating opportunities for children in difficult circumstances. Marcus was also encouraged to join these activities, helping him understand the value of sharing and love. Conflicts and misunderstandings still arose, but love and patience helped them overcome it all. Marcus gradually became a bridge between two worlds, the lavish world of Mrs. Eleanor and Charles, and the simple but warm world of Mrs. Angel. The boy learned to love both sides and realized that family was not just where one was born, but also where one was loved and accepted unconditionally. The journey of Mrs. Eleanor, Mrs. Angel, Charles, and Marcus was an emotional one, with profound lessons about love, forgiveness, and compassion. The story concluded with an image of their family gathered together in the mansion garden, a place that had once been a symbol of loneliness, now filled with laughter and happiness. Marcus, with a bright smile, looked up at the sky and felt that finally, he had found a place where he truly belonged, a real family. Marcus began attending a prestigious school, where the differences in skin color and background brought him many difficulties. The scrutinizing eyes, the taunts, and the discrimination made Marcus endure a lot of pressure. However, with the support of Mrs. Eleanor, Mrs. Angel, and especially Charles, Marcus gradually learned how to face these challenges. Mrs. Eleanor decided to hire a private tutor for Marcus, not only to help him improve his academic performance but also to provide him with a companion. Marcus's tutor was Mr. Robert, a middle-aged man who had been a teacher and had extensive experience teaching children with difficult backgrounds. Mr. Robert not only helped Marcus understand his lessons but also taught him how to be confident and proud of himself. The lessons with Mr. Robert weren't just about school knowledge but also life lessons, about the value of kindness and patience. Gradually, Marcus found joy in studying, and he began to show his talents in many areas, especially in mathematics and sports. Mr. Robert also encouraged Marcus to participate in extracurricular activities, helping the boy make friends and integrate into the school environment. One of the major turning points in the story was when Marcus decided to join the school's basketball team. Although initially faced with prejudice from some team members, Marcus's persistence and effort gradually earned him their respect. The tough matches and grueling practices helped Marcus grow, and he began to gain the respect of his teammates. In addition, the relationship between Charles and Mrs. Angel also developed positively. Charles, after realizing his past mistakes, tried to make amends and reconnect with Mrs. Angel. They had long conversations, sharing old memories and the dreams they once had. Gradually, Mrs. Angel began to open up, and their relationship was no longer strained. Charles also decided to involve Mrs. Angel in his business. He provided opportunities for Mrs. Angel to work in a better environment, helping her become more financially independent. This not only made Mrs. Angel feel more confident but also allowed her to contribute positively to Marcus's life. Another important event in the story was when Mrs. Eleanor decided to hold a grand party at the mansion to introduce Marcus to her friends and business partners. This was a significant step, as she wanted Marcus to be recognized and loved as an official member of the family. The party took place in a formal yet warm atmosphere. Marcus, although initially nervous, confidently stood before everyone and introduced himself with the support of Mrs. Angel and Charles. During the party, Mrs. Eleanor gave an emotional speech, sharing her journey and how Marcus had changed her life. She spoke about love, forgiveness, and hope for a better future for everyone. Her speech moved many people, and they began to look at Marcus differently, not as an outsider but as part of this prestigious family. The story also depicted the simple yet meaningful moments of their daily lives. The family gathered together in the evenings, cooking and enjoying the meals Mrs. Angel prepared. The morning walks Mrs. Eleanor and Marcus took in the garden, sharing small yet warm stories. The times Charles took Marcus to the stadium to cheer for his favorite team. These moments, though small, were the threads that connected their hearts, creating a true family. Marcus gradually understood that, regardless of the past, the most important thing was the love and acceptance everyone gave each other. The boy realized that family was not just where you were born, but where you were loved, protected, and inspired to become a better person. The story ended with the image of Marcus, now a confident and enthusiastic teenager, standing on the basketball court with shining eyes. Beside him were Mrs. Eleanor, Mrs. Angel, and Charles, those who had always been by his side, supporting and loving him unconditionally. They looked up at the blue sky together, and in that moment, they all felt peace and happiness, a feeling that only family love could bring.